Welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. This is a webinar series each Tuesday where we faithfully focus on education for the people of God. Topics from faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to how-tos in congregational life and the impacts of current realities on the life of the church will be featured. Each webinar has clear suggestions about what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world God imagines for us. I am your host, Reverend Dr. Chris Davies. Today, we're talking about leadership of and with small and rural church pastors. I want to invite Roberto Ochoa to lead this webinar in conversation with the study that he has had over the past several years.
Gracias, Chris, and welcome. Bienvenidos to these important conversations on rural and small church leaderships. There's no question that 2020 has brought us many challenges: COVID-19, the economic crisis, and now the nationwide anti-Blackness protests due to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And often many of these comes from the lens of the urban and metro lens. But we need to remember 20% of the US populations are in rural and small communities. How are these communities coping with all of these events? And how are our pastoral leadership responding to the needs in our rural settings? So hola, I'm Roberto Ochoa. I'm the Program Associate for Congregations of Color and Ethnic Identified Congregations in the United Church of Christ, part of the Justice and Local Church Ministries. I am so pleased, and it's my pleasure to have you with us today and these amazing panelists that we have with us today. So I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves with their titles, where they're located, and anything else that may be hitting them, that may be with them. So let's begin with Reverend Emily Munger.
Hi. I am Pastor Emily. I am serving currently in Pierre, South Dakota. So we are a church that worships pre-COVID, I guess I'll say, about 75 on a Sunday. And I, previous to this congregation, was serving a very rural congregation. And it was, full membership of 35, I believe. And there were literally tumbleweeds across the road every time I drive there. So my context is a bit mixed in my current location. We are the state capital, but we're also rural in a national setting.
Thank you, Pastor Emily. Next, Reverend Nicholas Knobloch.
Yes, this is Reverend Nicholas Knobloch. I am currently serving as the pastor of Powder River Congregational UCC in Broadus, Montana. We're about 90 miles from both the Wyoming border and the South Dakota border in the southeast corner. I'm a lifelong Midwesterner who grew up in the UCC at the local church, going to camps, being part of camp staffs, going to General Synod, going to historically related schools. And in 2016, I moved right out here after graduating from seminary and have been the local pastor in a small town of under 500 people in the heart of ranching and particularly within the beef country. And this is where I've been, and this has been the totality of my vocational ministry.
Welcome. Thank you, Pastor Nick. Next, I'd like to invite Reverend Nayiri Karjian.
Thank you, Roberto. I am Nayiri Karjian. I am the General Minister of the Living Water Association, Ohio Northeast, Heartland Conference, United Church of Christ. And I have been here for about 2.5 years. I am Armenian by ethnicity, if you're wondering what kind of name I have. And I have served about 11 congregations around the country in both settled and interim capacities. And I'm delighted to be here, part of this team today.
Thank you, Reverend Nayiri. Welcome. Okay, now I'd like to invite Reverend Piwa Langini.
Thank you all. It's great to be able to join you. I am the Reverend Piwa Langeni. I am the pastor of Salah Center UCC, which is a new church start in Lansing, Michigan, which is where I am currently And as of about a month and a half ago, I am the ambassador for innovation and engagement in the card office of the United Church of Christ at the national setting. I am a deployed employee, so even I wouldn't be in Cleveland. But yeah, I'm really excited to be able to join everyone on this call and share a little bit more about what I'm up to, and especially as it relates to small and rural churches.
Thank you, Reverend Piwa. And I'd like to invite Reverend David Shane.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm Dave Shane. I live in a rural area of Washington State where I'm retired, but I still work part-time for the United Church of Christ Church Building and Loan Fund, helping churches facing uncertain futures and dealing with perhaps closure and legacy.
Thank you. So happy that you're with us today. I'm so happy all of you are. So let's get to it. So as a former pastor of color, a man of color, and a former pastor of a Euro-descendant predominant congregations, there was times that I had to either explain or translate events that may occur in our communities of color, ethnic identified communities for our congregations. So my question is, what has been the reactions to your communities regarding all of the events that I mentioned earlier this year? And how have you been able to navigate and lead during these extraordinary times? I'd like to begin with Pastor Emily.
Thank you, Roberto. I think I'll begin by saying that, I'm not sure of the audience that I have. And so I think so much of this rural context matters in that we're all so different in our context. And so I can speak from mine. And that is in Pierce, South Dakota, our minority population, so to speak, is Lakota. And so we have about 10% population Lakota. And I say that in part because we can, in rural settings, sometimes convince ourselves that this is an issue that's not among us. And for example, racism, that we can think that maybe it just doesn't exist because almost everybody looks like me. And the truth is that it's absolutely here. And the way that I approach all of my ministry and how to sort of unveil, so to speak, or maybe bring light to an issue that I have had experience in other locations of, is to speak to deep personal relationships that I have. And so from a pastoral lens, I can just offer you what occurred on Sunday morning in our worship service. And that is, I was able to lift up a moment in my life when I was living in Newark, New Jersey, which is a little bit different than Pierce, South Dakota. And my experience working in a social work capacity with young men and women of color and their experiences with police officers in their midst. And I brought forward the story of one of the young African-American men that I met with regularly for assistance. And he would speak very candidly and almost as if it was a norm that he would be profiled in the white neighborhood his girlfriend lived in every time he walked back to the bus station. And I said, I know it can feel really hard as a person who has learned to fully trust law enforcement because we know who they are and we love them. And so to speak of racial profiling can feel really challenging in this context. And I wanted to bring forward stories that were not my own and to speak about how in my privilege, it's really impossible to understand. And so maybe allowing yourself, in my congregation or whomever was listening on Facebook Live now, to invite them into listening to the stories of others. Because I think a part of being rural is you are naturally isolated from what is going on in metro areas and in any really other community other than your own. Now, social media, news, etc., is one lens, but that to me is not the most effective lens to learn from. And so I have and always will encourage personal relationships to be a catalyst for change in particular rural settings. And so I started by saying that we're so isolated and we don't have diversity, but that's not true either. Like, we can just think it's true. If you look around and if you take the effort and challenge yourself, there's absolutely, I would think it would be hard pressed to find, even in the most rural areas, a community that does not have at least a contingency of people of color. And so for us, that is our Indigenous friends and neighbors, and how we interact and how we engage is as significant here. I mean, that's our main focus, I would say. And so it's easier to think away from us than it is to feel local. And so for me, I like to address one-on-one conversations about what are we doing to fully engage racism here among our Native American friends. So that would be, I think I've probably taken my time, but that would be how I approach it as a pastor. And I think that hopefully I've highlighted a bit of the context that I am in, and I'm sure that even Nicholas can speak a little differently to the context he's in.
Very, very quickly though, how has the COVID-19 affected you all?
Similar in that we feel a little bit isolated from it. So in Sioux Falls, there's been a hit, and even though people come from Sioux Falls to Pierre all the time, we think, we're fine. I mean, not really, actually, people are taking it very seriously. My congregation has been wonderful about sort of, caution and thinking about others before ourselves, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of distrust of what the information coming our way is. And I think that makes it especially tricky to know how to approach it, even for myself, like, where am I getting my resources about what's what? That has been a huge part of my learning curve as a minister, to say, let me, before I am too quick to the punch to say something, let me do my research. Let me sit with it for just a minute. And that can feel really hard at the pace everything is going.
Thank you, Pastor Emily. Yeah. Pastor Nick, same questions.
Yeah, so I think the biggest overwhelming feeling for all of the realities within small town life here is the question that gets brought up again and again is, how do we get back to normal? And kind of the responsibility of local church leadership and my leadership is reminding people that asking the question, how do we get back to normal, has never been a faithful question. Our faith requires us to look at the world as it actually is and not as we would like it to be. So it means acknowledging that there's a lot of grief and anger, there's a lot of pain and sorrow, and now there's a lot of also guilt as well surrounding what is going on in the world. And for pastoral caregivers and people of faith of many different traditions, how do we tend to those feelings? I know there's a lot about asking people to think rationally and respond rationally and use their minds, but we're also asked to think of the heart and to tend to people where they are and where they see themselves, and to come to problems sideways, so we can come alongside people who are in these situations. A lot like what Pastor Emily said, we do feel this isolation. There's this, at times, resentment within the community that says, nobody cares about us. Nobody knows where we are. They're not worried about my problems. They're not worried about how everything is happening here. So why should we care about others? And so that is one of the big challenges, right? That's one of the big struggles that we face. And so when we look at how we attend to these needs, how do we attend to these systems, there's a conversation that you always have to have around whether or not you try to do it as efficiently as possible or as resilient as possible, right? Is it a sustainable model? Because rarely do efficiency and resilience work together. To make the most efficient systems, it usually comes at the cost of sustainability. And so when you want things to be grown well and take root in a community and in a congregation, sometimes it takes time, and it takes time to have those roots set in, and to really be able to grow in a way that's natural for your environment. Sometimes you need to push and prod and kind of help things move along, but you need to make sure that it is happening within the community. And then finally, kind of in terms of how we engage is by making sure you're actually calling, in the middle of COVID-19 and the health risks and the serious health risks, and in the county that has yet to have a single case since the beginning. We have yet to record a positive case, and our county is roughly the size of Connecticut. And yes, we have under 2,000 people, and so there are definitely more cows than people in this county. But it means checking in with a public health nurse. It means checking in with commissioners. It's right now, right? It's having conversations with the sheriff's department and asking how only are they doing, how are they handling it, and what measures do they see are necessary? And particularly as people who that live in small communities, you need to take that time to make sure you're building those relationships, to see if there is solidarity among those who make decisions, and to see if you can have those conversations in helpful ways that grow sustainable practices. And so that's where we are at right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Nick. Really appreciate it. So, Reverend Nayiri, as a conference leader, what have you been seeing or experiencing with the congregations in the rural areas and small congregations that you oversee?
I've been thinking a lot about this question since you invited me to this conversation. And we have 150 congregations in Living Water Association, and about 35 of them can be considered rural. And what I see in those congregations is the continued or increasing way that life continues to be more complex and complicated. And there's a lot of confusion, a lot of unclarity, but there are some things that are very clear. I think those churches are struggling and have been in grief for a long time because rural communities are not growing as robustly as perhaps city communities. And these people have been grieving the loss of their children who go and never come back. So there has been a sense of loss for a long, long time in those congregations. That, in my opinion, has brought up the fact that they would like things to be simple. And they would like processes to be simple. They would like the answers to be simple. Although these are people who really have capacity to think complex ideas, but life has become too complex. So give us the answer and make it simple. Don't complicate things for us. So I increasingly hear this request, not only from our rural churches, from also other congregations. Give us one page, 1, 2, 3, 4 that we can do. And this to me is a big so grief is one of the things that I see. The desire for clarity and simplicity is there. And I am always impressed by their commitment and their sense of ownership of their community and of their church. So that makes them, our rural communities, so committed to bettering the community in which they live, and that sense of family that brings them together. So many Sundays I have driven to some of our rural congregations, and I thought I would find nothing there. And I go in, and the church is all set up for worship. People are pitching in to make it happen, and there is life, even if there are 40 people in that congregation. The people who are there have energy, they have commitment for the church, and COVID has just complicated things. And because some of the news and some of what they hear from different sources conflict, so they're not exactly sure. And as Reverend Emily mentioned, they aren't really sure if it's going to get to them. However, we are beginning to find out that even those small communities, the number of infections are rising. And I am actually quite impressed also by our pastors who are leading them, because they're finding a way to be church and do church in the midst of COVID. And 20 of our congregations do not have internet or capacity for technology. Hence, they cannot gather as a church in person or even just online. But these pastors are writing, using snail mail, they're using phone calls, and people already in rural communities, as you know, have a connectedness, an informal kind of connectedness to each other. So those things are very actively engaged and are continuing to happen. And so I find life in our rural congregations, and I do find that many have major commitment as well as generosity. I have to tell you that I celebrate our rural congregations who are so committed even to the larger church that the giving has not suffered in our association at this point. I am grateful, I am impressed, I thank God and I thank our churches. Our pastors are tired, but they are hanging in there. They continue to take care of their flock, and the church continues to do mission as well. Many of our rural congregations are community centers. That is where the community goes in order to gather, and that also helps the congregation be part of the larger community that gives them life. And some struggle with the future, and in that case, we connect with Reverend Shane and go from there.
Thank you, Reverend Nayiri. Thank you for your insights. Pastor Pila, not only are you following the trends and data for national, you yourself are a pastor as well. So what are you experiencing and seeing?
Yeah, as a pastor who is Black and queer, among other things, in a primarily white, cis, heteronormative denomination, this has always been a thing that I've had to kind of like navigate and, figure out how, as a Black person leading, when I may be the only Black person in the room, really trying to find the balance, right, of being able to share and kind of excavate the gospel that is with and in the people who are gathering, without, activating the tendency toward folk kind of leaning into, a Black or a queer agenda, just because that's the body that I have in trying to engage in ministry. And so, even at Salas Center, as Reverend Nayiri was saying, a big portion of our being at Salas Center is the LGBTQ resource and community center, the only one in Lansing that was founded with Salas Center UCC. In this time of COVID, it's really difficult because, we literally created a space that was visible, that was accessible, so that people didn't have to be underground or ashamed of their identities because society isn't ready to have them be who they are, And so I'm constantly kind of concerned, we have a community that doesn't have we don't have membership roles. We're the greater Lansing area. And so there are many people who are at Salas Center who maybe I've never physically met, but this has been a place of gathering. And so what does that mean, for people who already have been invisibilized by society to then have this, this invisible virus kind of like ravaged through, and not just this virus, right? And a lot of us are faced with, state violence or, the statistics even around, young Black trans women in particular, having an average lifespan of 22, I believe, and so every November when we're going through all the trans folk who've been killed in the previous year, almost all of them are younger than my adult daughter. And when I meet a youth, and just statistically recognizing that they are statistically have just lived half of their lives. And it's a disgusting trend that's even a thing that's continuing to happen. And so really trying to balance, the realities, whether or not we have trans folk in this community, or if we have Black folk in this community, or if we have, people who are different levels of economic access, it is our issue, right? As long as there's anyone in the body that, in this collective body, we all have to work to kind of eradicate those trends that are happening, whether or not they're in our direct communities. And understand definitely the challenge, doing that when, this community may have like specific concerns that it's facing. And so I'm really excited though to be able to have this role, on this national level where, my work is to kind of listen to and pay attention to the different kinds of innovation that's already happening across the US and other places, not just the church too, but like being able to then, fuel back to the churches, from the churches, what is already happening, you know, and particularly in churches that are small membership or new church starts, you know, or even in rural spaces, you know, innovation is a part of the lifeblood of these congregations, you know, being able to exist and to thrive even. Innovation has been an essential part. And so I don't know if we have like a little chart here, but if you were to navigate over to the ucc.org website, if you were to type in statistical profile, the Center for Analytics, Research and Development and Data Office, which is the one where my position resides, puts together a statistical profile each year, and we're actively in the process of doing the one for this 2020, which will be very different than previous years since we're in the middle of a pandemic. But based on the numbers even from last year, you know, one of the first things that kind of struck me was the fact that the majority of our churches are small membership churches. And that really struck me as a surprise because, you know, I've primarily mostly served churches that are small in membership, and often kind of the energy in there is like, oh, we're small but mighty is one phrase that I often hear, or, you know, back when we used to have XYZ, this many members, you know, but every time I've served in these smaller congregations though, I have always felt God's Spirit so very active and present. And even in these numbers in the statistical profiles, you know, even of 2019, you know, almost 92% of UCC churches have memberships fewer than 400 people. And over 70% of our churches have fewer than 200 members. And so really we're almost at about half of our churches in the United Church of Christ that are fewer than 100 members. And to me, what that has meant really has just been that, you know, we're not alone, even though it might be one UCC church for hundreds of miles, right? We are the majority in the United Church of Christ, are these small membership churches. And I think that's an absolutely beautiful thing, you know, that offers possibility, you know, and being able to be more creative and faithful when we're not despairing that it's just a few of us here, but rather, you know, it's a few of us among many who are a few of us. And even looking at the patterns of like membership attendance and membership, the ratio is quite high for churches that are under 50 members. And so I find this as a possibility of hope, you know, whether that means, you know, figuring out new ways of organizing in a time of a pandemic, or if that is about, you know, finding ways to faithfully, you know, wrap up one form of ministry and engage in a different way to support other ministries. I think this is a time for us, you know, even as we're trending more towards small membership churches, you know, just based on demographics and general population and whatnot. But if anything, you know, the current small churches are the leaders for those who are going to be joining our rank as small church membership congregations. And so I'm excited to be able to, you know, spend time, you know, through ones and zeros or digitally these next few months, and I'm hoping in person, you know, as travel gets reactivated, to be with you all and just listen and reflect back to you the Christ that I already see at work in your communities, and that to me I think is a time of possibility and hope that hope we can all kind of lean into, especially when there's so much despair.
Thank you for your insights, Pastor Piwa. So Reverend Dave, in your role of assisting congregations map out and discern their futures, what are you seeing and experiencing currently?
Thank you, Roberto. I grew up in a rural farm community in Southern Illinois and now live in a rural area of small farms here in Washington State. What I see in rural churches and communities is both the real risk to each, as well as a great resilience and strength. And so I want to focus on the strengths and gifts of smaller and rural churches that can help them and all of us in some ways face the future together. As churches, especially in rural areas, may be looking to a time of relaxing social distancing, now is the time for churches to look to that future and ask, who is God calling us to be? And what is God calling us to do? One of the strengths that I've always seen in small and rural churches, and Nayiri mentioned this, is a great sense of responsibility and commitment to each other and to the church. And so now is the time to start those responsible, perhaps difficult conversations, however that can happen, asking what will the future of our church be and how do we start to live into it, perhaps in new ways, hopefully as well. I'm sure that those thoughts are already in members' minds. So it's time to find a way to surface and to focus those thoughts. And even though whole congregations might not be able to gather together in person, perhaps some leaders can begin to envision that church future and then share it with others. Those conversations, especially in this time of crisis that we're all facing, really begin with lots of prayer, Bible study, and meditation. And even with social distancing, those prayers can begin to unite a scattered congregation now. Within a mile or two of my home, on either side, are two historic farmer grange halls, still being used in the small villages they are in. One of the gifts of rural communities and churches, and both Nicholas and Emily have mentioned this, is strong relationships, commitment to each other, and the valuing of partnership and collaborations. Rural churches have a long tradition of sharing buildings, sharing ministries, sharing pastoral leadership, sharing gardens, sharing great food and property. The future of the small and rural churches calls for a furthering of relationships, collaboration, and partnerships within the church, as well as with neighbors and other churches, community service organizations, leaders in the community, and more. I was really glad to hear Nicholas talk about that relationship and reaching out to those folks in the community. No church or community can do this alone. Our churches and our communities won't make it unless we are working and supporting each other. During these times of difficulty, it has really been uplifting to see those collaborative efforts rise up in communities and churches. In the UC News, there are stories all the time about small churches that have seen their ministries and participation expand by reaching out in service to and partnership with their communities and their neighbors, meeting community needs. Small churches share their space with musicians, with theater and artist groups, as well as community service organizations, 12-step programs, and English as second language classes. They share their gardens and kitchens to feed others, especially children. And I really think that this is not just to see these other groups as renters or people using the building, but really as allies and partners, and build those relationships as stakeholders, really for the future of the ministry and the life of the community. A small rural church in the New England invited another church from the Unity tradition to share their building and join in mission together. UCC small congregations united across a great distance to share resources, leadership, and ministers, even across many miles. Congregations often, even small congregations, can have a big voice and witness for inclusion, welcome, and racial justice. The pandemic has quickly introduced us all to new technologies, ways of communicating, worshiping, and being together and supporting each other, like this Zoom today. I know small worship congregations that have seen their worship participation increase using online technology. The possibilities for expanded use of technologies is significant for small congregations, including small congregations without pastoral leadership or small house churches where leadership is shared among members. In these difficult times of crisis, small churches have something to share within themselves as well as with us, and they have strengths of resilience and relationships, of commitment to each other, and values of collaboration and partnership and responsibility. And it's good to know that there are options as well, new options for shaping their futures.
Thank you, Reverend Dave, for your insights. Pretty appreciate it. So I recently heard someone ask, what does thriving look like for a rural and small church? And what are the resources necessary to make this happen? So Pastor Nick, from your perspective, what does thriving look like for you all?
Thanks, Roberto. Thriving first looks like reminding each other, reminding your colleagues in ministry, reminding your neighbors, reminding everyone within your community that you are enough, right? Because the question again and again is, am I doing enough? Am I reading enough? Am I talking to enough people? But it really comes down to a self-worth that a lot of small congregations have, is whether or not we are enough. Are we enough to attract ministers? Are we enough to attract couples? Are we enough to attract new people to the congregation? Are we, if you are enough with what you are doing, and yet, right, because it doesn't end there. Yes, you are enough. You have value, you have worth, and you have the ability to do something within your community. You have the ability, you have the creative capacity and the ability to take ownership and to take responsibility in your community. And so with that, you do the work, right? And so part of doing the work means acknowledging your local history. It means acknowledging that perhaps the reason why you're here in the first place is because the land wasn't always your land. It means recognizing the fact that not everybody had equal access to land in general, or opportunity, or education, or particular resources. Even looking at our UCC history, right? We take a pride in a lot of our great firsts when it comes to who we have ordained as clergy, but how many of them ended up in pastoral settings? How many of them were used and abused, sent overseas? How many of them never made it to a pastoral setting and had to work at conference levels? How many of them retired from the ministry after their first year and switched denominations, right? So we have to take some responsibility in this recognition so you can do the work. And so for everyone who is wondering, how do you attract clergy? How do you do this? You do part of the work of ministry in your congregation. You do the work by acknowledging these realities, by taking account of your history, by calling the people within your community, by checking in and not assuming that you already know what the heartbeat feels like within the community, but that you take it into new. In some ways, you join the Pewas of the world who are starting new churches and look afresh to your community as if you were a new church start. Because what you can always provide is sanctuary and Sabbath, right? You can be a sanctuary for vulnerable people within your communities, particularly in communities that don't have very many resources. And how many of the kids from rural communities have left because they don't feel safe? Being a sanctuary is one of the most important things that actually saves lives in the communities that you're in, and not taking that as a serious responsibility is life-threatening. But beyond that, you can also take Sabbath seriously. You can take rest. You can say that you are enough and that you've always been enough, and in the eyes of God, you are enough. And so you can rest with one another. You can rejoice with one another. You can cry with one another. And so you can join in those ways that make it a thriving place. Because if you can't take Sabbath seriously, and if you can't take sanctuary and create sanctuary, it's going to be really hard to thrive, because these are bedrocks of all of our faith traditions. And taking those things, make it happen. And I just want to say, just before I hand it over to Emily or back to Roberto, is that hiring a young, straight, white, cisgender male isn't going to solve all of your problems. You're going to have to work, and it's going to be really important, and it's going to be really hard. And yet it's the work that you can do. It's the ministry to which you are all called as both lay leaders, as ordained pastors, as, everyone, as members of your community. This is your responsibility to the church, and the work of Christ in the world is all of our responsibilities. So know that, but do the work, do what you can, and remember that you are enough and you have always been enough. Thank you.
Amen. Amen, Pastor Nicholas. Pastor Emily.
First of all, I just love all this collaboration and the perspectives we're bringing today. I'm learning alongside you, so thanks for that. I want to offer a lens today in hopes of talking about thriving churches that addresses a couple things we've already mentioned briefly. One of those is that grief that we talked about when communities, entire communities, have felt economic hardship in a way that is in some, reminiscent of the 1980s farm crisis and the like. And that grief is, number one, very real, and it leads to very real anxiety. And so if you are a church leader listening in today, or if you are a church leader on a laity or authorized alike, hear this: the most profound work you can do right now is to reduce anxiety in your congregation. And by doing so many of the things that David offered, which is talk about the resiliency, relive the ways that your strengths as a small community are valued, and live into those relationships, which I think is the second place I want to go with this. Churches that thrive in small communities tend to, in my experience, and as I've surveyed this, particularly in South Dakota, the churches that are willing to do the ecumenical efforts that ask us to lay aside some of our denominational distinction, which is, I love the UCC, but I did not grow up UCC. So I'm like ecumenical to my core. And what I believe in small churches or small communities more than anything is we need to see across some theological difference and say our community thriving is more significant than how we say the Lord's Prayer. So let's say the Lord's Prayer in all ways, alternating on Sundays. I mean, however you want to frame it, the context that you're in is unique to you. Figure that out. As Nicholas said, like there's so much to value in each context. You are enough. But also say, maybe that Baptist church down the street isn't so bad, I mean, like maybe we can see beyond the differences that small town life can oftentimes amplify. I know I grew up, let me just say, I grew up in a small community of under 100, or under 1,000, next to a small community 10 miles away of under 1,000. And I was under the impression that those girls were all snobs. I mean, like, for real, like they just all were, and then I became an adult and I realized that was a myth. And so if we can start to pull down those walls that really do divide us within small communities, hey, I think the sky's the limit for ecumenical interaction in small communities. Two brief ways I'll say that I've seen this practically lived out. Two-Layer United Church, I'm going to give them a little shout out here. Their small community, farming community under, I want to say 500, saw 3 different churches all struggling. And not only did they all give up their distinct denominational identity, but they gave up their buildings and they built one new one. And let me tell you, that is one of the coolest churches we have in the South Dakota Conference, because they have made that effort. And it's not easy. Of course, it's not easy, but they've made that effort to say, across difference, unite for the sake of the gospel. Second example is a small town, similar size, decided we really want to do something for our youth. We can't do everything, but this is distinctive ministry matters. And so they collectively hired a youth minister for the town in which their churches were serving. And I just thought, wow, I can learn from that. I can learn about ecumenical engagement in that way. And so I could say a million things, but in terms of thriving in small towns, breaking down the barriers of difference, even denominational, I think that's essential.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really awesome, Pastor Emily. Thank you so much. Pastor Piwa, same question to you.
Yeah, I'm activated by all of what we've already heard, and just feeling excited about what still yet can be. But I would say thriving to me, and I know I'm saying this as a representative of the data team, is more than just the numbers that we report back. I believe if we were to really look at what thriving is in these communities, we can look differently at, oh, well, it used to be 800 numbers, now it's only 80, but really then to say, are we still engaging with the community in a way that the community is aware of who and what we are doing. One question I like to ask congregations, is if we magically disappear today, how would the community be affected, right? And if the answer is not at all, then I would encourage us, then what are the ways in which we can, be noticed if we were to randomly disappear today? And to me, it's the answers to that question is what thriving is about, so it's not even as much about how many of the people are doing it, but rather what is the impact of our being here in this time and in this place. And that, my hope is that, we can kind of consciously move from, the church of the 50s that was important about, membership, because it was about, the numbers, because it was about, people living within a geographic, region and kind of gathering in those spaces in that manner. But because we become so mobile as a society with shifting details and demographics, I do believe that, thriving really is going to move us more toward impact and our responses to the seemingly unending needs in the world and in our communities and the different places where we are. And so being able to, again, like engaging in the ways that Pastor Nick and Pastor Emily have named, and I'm sure many of us will continue to talk about, just being able to like re-envision how it is that we're being called to do and be in this world. Often reminded of, the story of the young boys lunch that was shared with the many on the hillside. That is what thriving feels like to me. Many of us don't have the money or the people or the this or the that. The list is long, right? But finding ways to lean into the one who makes something out of nothing, that to me is what thriving looks and feels like.
I love that image. I really love that image, Pastor Pio. Thank you so much. Briefly, Pastor Reverend Nayiri.
Associations and conferences have done thriving in very special ways, and they have often used processes, and they have often tried to address the problem and solve it. And I think that is often the way we deal with issues. We find the problem and then we go after and say, what is the solution? And then someone comes up with, a new idea, and they say, oh, there is a book, read this, and it will actually make your church flourish. I think those times are over. I think traditional ways of doing thriving no longer works. And it is time to experiment, to explore, to find new ways of doing it. So I find churches who are, especially smaller congregations, who are willing to experiment and explore, to actually define their purpose and mission, what God has called them to be and do, and have a sense of community larger than themselves, and have joy in the midst of it to thrive. So such a sense of joy is so needed today in the world, especially in the midst of a world that is bent on violence. We seek that place, and we want the joy and the peace. And so if rural communities can actually nurture that sense and then go on exploring and experimenting, and I do find small congregations quite adaptive. That is another thing that they can do, as long as they understand what the reasons are. So conversation is needed for those purposes. But I think that exploring and experimenting actually does help the church grow, and celebrating the gifts of the people and using them, because each person is important, and you have to celebrate each gift and put them to use for the good of the community.
Thank you, Reverend Nayiri. Reverend Dave.
It's hard to add anything more than what's already been said here. It's terrific in terms of seeing community relationship and community development as what we do as part of who we are as the church, and because it's a both and. As we build up the community, we build up the church. As we build up the church, we build up community. And and seeing and celebrating the gifts of every person. I think, I think a thriving church has a sense that it knows its strength and it knows what it celebrates. You can always tell a church that isn't quite so thriving because they will tell you what their problems are and what the issues are and everything else. But a thriving church is one where there are bright-eyed people and bright-eyed leadership that are called together and have a vision for what the future is for this congregation and are excited about it and want to live into that and commit themselves to doing that.
Thank you, Reverend Dave. And thank you also for those that have been asking questions and contributing. And there's one question in here that, the guy says, what do you say to leaders who are in small rural churches who are significantly more conservative than the national UCC polity? How can they bridge the divide? And I'm going to pass this over to Pastor Emily.
Well, luckily, I just typed a response to that. So, I think the reality for me is that I grow and I am made stronger in my witness to the gospel of inclusion when I hear the voices that are different than mine. And so rather than saying, hey, we need to sort of narrow our focus here, my perspective, as you heard in my ecumenical plea there, is to broaden our own ability to hold tension in our conversations. And so we have a number of those small churches here in South Dakota, and some of them have chosen to gracefully leave the denomination, which when that is a sort of a relationship-based decision, I commend that. I mean, honestly, I think that's fine for churches if they make that decision. There's some who have left under more tenuous circumstances. And I think let's talk about covenant and our relationships with one another, because when we choose to leave, I think we need to do it in a particular way. But for those who want to stay, I will say that the perspectives across our own spectrum in the UCC is significant in and of itself. Because I did not grow up in UCC, and when I came to the UCC, I was sort of blown away by how we're actually able to hold that tension. With the caveat that our conversations always have to begin with the Spirit in me acknowledges the Spirit in you. Because if there's ever differences that are harming the image of God in somebody else, I think that we have to be very apparent and very cognizant that that's not okay. However, I think there's a lot of room for difference. And I think that we need to do that in a spirit of engagement rather than consternation. That would be my personal response.
Thank you so much. Is there someone else that would like to respond to that? We have a couple more minutes.
Sure. When I start in a church that's primarily white, one of the first things I will open with is encouraging folks to look around them and look at the diversity in the room. And 100% of the time I've said that, people will laugh. And I'm like, no, really, I'm serious. Please look at the diversity around you. And they're like, okay. And they look at themselves, and then I just name out loud, it may not be a racial diversity here, but like we have diversity here, and in that process, I actually met someone who used to be a lunar cartographer. Like, what? Right? But this idea that we already do diversity, and so diversity doesn't have to be dangerous, And so really trying to help encourage folks to like lean into their skills of already knowing that we're not all the same. And that's okay, but like not to fear it when that difference is, a racial difference or a difference in sexuality or gender or nationality or whatever else, right? And I think especially now, right, in the cultural backdrop of everything, this is our time to really show and live into this God who calls us all from different places and in different ways, especially in UCC, right? With not just with our first, but with like the breadth of the diversity that we have theologically. This is our time to be leaders in a time where Christianity is weaponized for many of us. And we get to like breathe new life into a gospel that's supposed to be about life abundant for all of us. And so I think really just understanding that, one, we already do diversity, so that we don't have to be fearful of the kinds of diversity that we're not already doing.
With that, I want to say gracias. Thank you for participating in these conversations. I've been blessed in your presence and being part of it. And thank you for the gift that we were able to provide to United Church of Christ. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you so much to all of you who speak into the reality of what it is to be a leader in small and rural congregations, or a supporter of those leaders in small and rural congregations. As Piwa said, the majority of our congregations are small or rural. Having said that, if this conversation matters to you, if this is work that you are able to learn from and support, you can donate into the United Church of Christ Annual Fund by texting UCC to 41444. This is what I like to call the call to offering. You can also mail a check if that is more your style, and it would go to 700 Prospect, and you can email us about how to do that afterwards. These webinars are continuing to take on the care and equipping of the denomination. On Tuesdays, we talk about educational things. On Thursdays, we lean into the care of the soul. And what I would love to attend to in the midst of the care of the soul is let you know that on this Thursday, we're talking about mysticism and mindfulness, especially as so many people are equipping themselves to do the work of the gospel on the street. We need that self-care. So on Thursday, you can come and be attentive and listen to voices of wisdom across the denomination speaking about mysticism and mindfulness and practices that really care for our own souls. Having said that, Pastor Emily, would you be so kind as to pray us into the rest of our day?
I would love to. Before I do, real quickly, I know there was a question about part-time pastors for rural churches. So let me just give a plug for your committees on ministry and the resources they have for you. I'm the chair of my committee on ministry, and I know that if you can connect with any of the national staffers, they will be happy to give you the resources. We have, newly guidelines for clergy compensation that specifically addresses part-time ministry. So I think it's a great question. I didn't want it to go unaddressed, but that's enough for now. So if this is a posture for you that feels comfortable and spiritual, why don't you lift your palms up in this space today? As we enter the Pentecost story, this is the season of the church where we particularly call on Spirit, wisdom, Sophia. Let's pray. Spirit, comforter, guide. We have to trust in you today. We have no alternatives. For you are the one who knows the way. You are the one who has been behind us, prodding us into new territory. You are the one that has been stirring in innovative moments within our church for centuries. And you will be the one who leads us into a new tomorrow that is not without uncertainty, but is filled with faith. So guide this conversation as it's received, even into the time it is viewed, recorded. May all who have participated know that they are enough when they turn to your Spirit and trust in your gospel message. Free us from this space today in that good word. In your mercy we pray. Amen.
Amen, Pastor.